They called me just a factory girl who would never amount to anything. At 24 years old, working night shifts at Morrison Manufacturing for $8 an hour, I was invisible to the executives who made millions while we earned barely enough to survive. But what the arrogant CEO's son didn't know was that his dying grandfather had been watching me work for 3 years and had very different plans for the future of his $500 million empire. Watch until the end because you'll be absolutely shocked when you discover how a minimum wage factory worker ended up inheriting everything while the entire Morrison family got nothing. My name is Emma Rodriguez, and this is the true story of how I went from the factory floor to the executive boardroom in the most unexpected way imaginable. The factory life begins. Morrison Manufacturing had been producing automotive parts for 75 years when I started working there in early 2021. The massive factory complex employed over 3,000 workers across multiple shifts, and we manufactured everything from precision brake components to complex engine parts for major automobile companies including Ford, General Motors, Toyota, and Mercedes-Benz. The work was incredibly demanding, with 10-hour shifts, standing at assembly stations performing repetitive motions that made your hands cramp and your back ache, while supervisors constantly pressured us to work faster and meet impossible production quotas. I had taken the job immediately after dropping out of college during my junior year when my mother was diagnosed with stage 3 breast cancer and needed someone to help pay for expensive medical treatments that insurance wouldn't cover. The decision to leave school and work in manufacturing devastated me because I had been studying mechanical engineering with dreams of designing innovative production systems, but family comes first, and my mother needed me more than I needed a degree. Within the first month of working at Morrison Manufacturing, I discovered that I was exceptionally good at the work despite how physically exhausting it was every single day. My attention to detail was extraordinary compared to other workers, and I consistently caught quality problems that would have resulted in defective parts reaching customers and causing potential safety issues. I also started noticing inefficiencies in our production processes and began developing ideas for improvements that could save the company significant amounts of money while making the work easier and safer for employees like myself. The supervisor's recognition. My supervisor, Janet Walsh, was a tough woman in her 50s who had worked at Morrison Manufacturing for over 30 years and had seen thousands of workers come and go through the factory doors. After about 6 months of watching my performance, Janet pulled me aside during a break and said something that would change the trajectory of my entire life, even though I didn't realize it at the time. She told me that I had a rare gift for understanding how all the different pieces of the manufacturing process fit together and worked as an integrated system rather than just focusing on my individual assembly station like most workers did throughout their entire careers. Janet explained that she had been in manufacturing for decades and had only met a handful of people who possessed this kind of natural systems thinking ability, and she believed I was wasting my potential doing basic assembly work when I could be contributing so much more to the company. She encouraged me to submit some of my improvement ideas through the company's employee suggestion program and even offered to help me write up the proposals in the proper technical format that management would take seriously. What Janet didn't know was that I had been spending every lunch break and rest period studying advanced engineering manuals and production efficiency textbooks that I found in the factory's small employee library that nobody else ever used. I was absolutely fascinated by industrial engineering concepts and manufacturing optimization theories, and I consumed every piece of technical information I could find because learning about these systems made me feel connected to the dreams I had abandoned when I left college to support my family. The first improvement proposal. Following Janet's encouragement, I spent 3 weeks documenting a comprehensive proposal for redesigning the brake assembly line workflow that could reduce production time by 18% while simultaneously improving quality control and reducing worker injuries from repetitive strain. The proposal included detailed diagrams showing the current process flow, identified specific bottlenecks and inefficiency points, presented my recommended changes with supporting calculations, and projected cost savings that would exceed $2 million annually. I submitted the proposal through the official channels, expecting it would probably be ignored like most employee suggestions, but at least I would know that I had tried to make a difference. 3 weeks later, I was shocked when I received a notice to report to the main office for a meeting with senior management, which had never happened to a regular factory worker in the company's entire history, according to the rumors that spread rapidly through the production floor. When I arrived at the executive offices wearing my cleanest work clothes because I didn't own proper business attire, I was escorted into a large conference room where 5 men in expensive suits were waiting, along with my supervisor, Janet, who gave me an encouraging smile. The men introduced themselves as the Vice President of Operations, the Chief Manufacturing Officer, the Director of Process Engineering, and 2 production managers whose names I immediately forgot because I was so nervous about why they wanted to meet with me. The Vice President of Operations, who turned out to be David Morrison III, the founder's grandson and the CEO's son, looked at me with barely concealed contempt and asked in a condescending tone whether I really wrote the proposal myself, or if someone with actual engineering knowledge had helped me, because it seemed unlikely that a factory girl with no formal credentials could produce such technically sophisticated analysis. His insulting question made my blood boil, but I kept my composure and calmly explained that yes, I had written every word myself, and I would be happy to answer any technical questions they had about my recommendations to prove that I thoroughly understood the engineering principles involved. For the next 45 minutes, I defended my proposal against skeptical questions and challenges from the management team and explained the mathematical calculations behind my efficiency projections and demonstrated my deep understanding of manufacturing systems theory that I had learned through independent study. By the end of the meeting, everyone except David Morrison seemed genuinely impressed, and the chief manufacturing officer announced that they would conduct a pilot test of my recommendations on one production line to evaluate the results before potentially implementing the changes across the entire factory. David Morrison objected strongly and argued that the company shouldn't waste time and resources testing ideas from an uneducated factory worker who got lucky with one decent suggestion, but he was overruled by the other executives who recognized the potential value of my proposal. As I was leaving the conference room, David pulled me aside and said with a smirk that I shouldn't get too excited because factory girls like me would never be anything more than assembly line workers, no matter how many clever ideas we submitted, and I should focus on doing my actual job instead of pretending to be an engineer. The pilot program implementation of my brake assembly line redesign began 3 months later after the engineering department had reviewed my plans and made minor modifications to address some technical specifications I had missed due to my lack of formal training. I was assigned to work on the pilot line during the testing phase, so I could provide input and make real-time adjustments as we discovered issues that hadn't been apparent in the theoretical planning stage. The results exceeded everyone's expectations, including my own projections, because the redesigned workflow not only reduced production time by 22% instead of my predicted 18%, but also decreased defect rates by 37% and reduced worker injury reports by 41% compared to the old process. The cost savings analysis showed that implementing my design across all brake assembly lines would save Morrison Manufacturing approximately $3.8 million annually, which was nearly double my original estimate. Senior management was thrilled with these results and immediately approved company-wide implementation of the new process design, and I received a $5,000 bonus and a promotion to quality control specialist with a salary increase to $15 per hour, which felt like winning the lottery after years of struggling on minimum wage. David Morrison was furious about my success and started spreading rumors throughout the company that I must have stolen the ideas from somewhere, or that the engineering department had actually done all the real work and I was just taking credit for their efforts. But the other executives knew the truth, and several of them began approaching me privately to ask if I had any other improvement ideas that could be developed into similar projects. The mysterious old man,
About 6 months after my first successful project, I started noticing an elderly man in expensive suits who would occasionally appear on the factory floor, accompanied by security personnel, and observe the production operations from a distance. The other workers told me this was Thomas Morrison Sr., the 92-year-old founder of the company, who had built Morrison Manufacturing from a small machine shop in his garage into a $500 million industrial empire over 7 decades. Thomas Morrison rarely visited the factory anymore due to his advanced age and declining health, but when he did come, he would spend hours watching the workers and machinery with an intensity that suggested he was evaluating everything he saw with the critical eye of someone who had spent his entire life in manufacturing. I didn't think much about these visits until one afternoon when I was troubleshooting a quality problem on one of the production lines, and I looked up to find Thomas Morrison standing just a few feet away, watching me work with keen interest. He asked with several technical questions about what I was doing and why I had chosen that particular diagnostic approach, and I explained my reasoning while trying not to be intimidated by the fact that I was talking to a legendary industrialist worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Thomas Morrison listened carefully to my explanations and asked follow-up questions that demonstrated he possessed a sophisticated understanding of manufacturing systems despite his age and declining health, and he seemed genuinely interested in my perspective as someone who worked directly with the equipment and processes every single day. Our conversation lasted almost 30 minutes before his security detail reminded him that he had other appointments to attend. And as he was leaving, he told me that I reminded him of himself when he was young and hungry to learn everything possible about how things worked and could be improved. I had no idea at the time that this brief encounter would eventually change my life in ways I could never have imagined. The second major project. Encouraged by my previous success, I began developing an even more ambitious proposal to redesign the entire engine component production system, which was the most complex and expensive operation in the factory. This project required 6 months of intensive research and analysis, during which I studied every aspect of the current production process and identified dozens of opportunities for improvement in efficiency, quality control, worker safety, and cost reduction. My proposal was a comprehensive 68-page document with detailed engineering diagrams, mathematical models, cost-benefit analyses, and implementation timelines that would have impressed professional consultants who charged thousands of dollars for similar work. When I submitted this proposal to management, I expected another meeting with skeptical executives, but instead I received a personal invitation to present my ideas directly to Thomas Morrison Sr. himself in his private office at company headquarters, which was an unprecedented honor for a factory floor employee. The meeting was scheduled for a Thursday afternoon, and I was terrified because I would be presenting highly technical material to a legendary businessman who had forgotten more about manufacturing than I would ever learn. When I arrived at the headquarters building, I was escorted to Thomas Morrison's corner office, which had floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the factory complex and walls covered with photographs documenting 75 years of company history. Thomas Morrison greeted me warmly and invited me to sit down and explain my proposal in detail without worrying about formal presentation protocols, because he wanted to have a genuine conversation about my ideas, rather than sit through a stiff corporate pitch. For the next 2 hours, I walked him through every aspect of my engine component redesign proposal and answered his probing questions about technical specifications, implementation challenges, financial projections, and potential risks that could derail the project. The founder's confession. At the end of our meeting, Thomas Morrison sat back in his leather chair and was quiet for several minutes while he stared out the window at the factory below. Finally, he turned to me and said something that I will never forget as long as I live. He told me that he had been watching me work for almost 3 years since Janet Walsh had first mentioned that a young factory worker was showing extraordinary potential and natural engineering talent. Thomas Morrison explained that he had deliberately arranged to be present during several of my shifts so he could observe how I approached problems and interacted with the machinery and other workers. He said that in 75 years of running Morrison Manufacturing, he had met thousands of employees and hundreds of engineers, but he had rarely encountered someone who possessed my combination of practical skills, theoretical knowledge, creative problem-solving ability, and genuine passion for manufacturing excellence. Then Thomas Morrison told me something that shocked me completely. He said that his grandson, David Morrison III, who was supposed to inherit and lead the company, was an arrogant fool who had never worked a real day in his life and didn't understand or respect the manufacturing business that had created his family's wealth. Thomas Morrison was deeply worried about what would happen to the company and its 3,000 employees after he died if David took control, because David only cared about maximizing short-term profits and would probably destroy the company culture and operational excellence that had taken decades to build. Thomas Morrison told me that he had been searching for years to find someone who truly understood manufacturing at a deep level and who possessed the integrity and work ethic necessary to lead Morrison Manufacturing into the future and preserve everything he had built over his lifetime. He believed that I was that person, despite my young age and lack of formal credentials, because I had demonstrated the exact qualities that had made him successful when he founded the company 75 years ago. The impossible offer. Thomas Morrison then made me an offer that seemed absolutely impossible to believe. He said that he wanted to personally mentor me and teach me everything he knew about running a manufacturing business, and he would pay for me to complete my college degree while continuing to work at the company, developing improvement projects. He explained that he was 92 years old and knew he didn't have many years left, but he wanted to spend whatever time remained preparing me to eventually take over leadership of Morrison Manufacturing after he died. I thought he must be joking or testing me somehow, because the idea that a factory worker making $15 an hour could become the leader of a $500 million company seemed like an absurd fantasy. But Thomas Morrison was completely serious, and he explained that he had already instructed his attorneys to begin drafting legal documents that would ensure I received the training, education, and authority necessary to assume leadership of the company after his death. He acknowledged that his family would be furious and would probably fight the arrangement legally, but he had built Morrison Manufacturing from nothing, and he had the absolute right to decide who would control it after he was gone. Thomas Morrison told me that I needed to think carefully about whether I wanted to accept this incredible opportunity, because it would be an enormous responsibility and would require years of intense work and learning. But if I was willing to commit myself completely, he would give me the chance to build a career and legacy that most people could only dream about. I had no idea at the time that this brief encounter would eventually change my life in ways I could never have imagined.
The mentorship begins. I accepted Thomas Morrison's offer immediately, and we began what would become the most intensive educational experience of my life. Every week, I would spend several hours in his office discussing manufacturing strategy, business operations, financial management, leadership principles, and the countless lessons he had learned during 75 years of building and running a successful company. Thomas Morrison was a patient but demanding teacher who expected me to thoroughly prepare for our sessions and to think critically about every topic we discussed, rather than just accepting his wisdom without questioning assumptions. He arranged for me to audit advanced engineering and business courses at the local university and paid all the expenses so I could complete my degree while continuing to work full-time at the factory. He also began including me in high-level management meetings and strategic planning sessions so I could observe how executives made important decisions and learn to think about the company from a leadership perspective rather than just a worker's viewpoint. The other executives were confused and somewhat resentful about my sudden elevation to meetings where I clearly didn't belong according to normal corporate hierarchy, but Thomas Morrison made it clear that I was there under his personal sponsorship, and anyone who had problems with that arrangement could discuss it with him directly.
David Morrison was absolutely enraged by his grandfather's decision to mentor a factory girl, and he made several attempts to undermine my credibility and convince Thomas Morrison that I was manipulating him somehow. But Thomas Morrison saw through these transparent attempts at sabotage, and he actually seemed to enjoy watching David's frustration as I continued to prove my capabilities through successful projects and demonstrated warning. The family rebellion. As months passed and it became increasingly obvious that Thomas Morrison was grooming me to play a significant role in the company's future, the Morrison family began openly rebelling against what they saw as an unacceptable threat to their inheritance. David Morrison organized family meetings where they discussed strategies for removing me from the company and for pressuring Thomas Morrison to change his plans before it was too late. They hired attorneys to investigate whether Thomas Morrison was mentally competent to make major business decisions, and they started spreading rumors that I was taking advantage of an elderly man for personal gain. The situation became so hostile that Thomas Morrison's own son, the current CEO, Richard Morrison II, actually banned me from attending certain management meetings and tried to limit my access to his father. But Thomas Morrison responded by threatening to remove his son from the CEO position if the harassment continued, and he made it clear that he would not tolerate any interference with his right to choose his own successor. The family conflict became so intense that it started affecting company operations as executives were forced to choose sides between supporting Thomas Morrison's vision or maintaining good relationships with the family members who currently controlled day-to-day operations. I felt terrible about causing such conflict within the Morrison family, but Thomas Morrison insisted that I had done nothing wrong and that the family's reaction proved exactly why he needed to find leadership outside the family bloodline. The health crisis. In early 2024, Thomas Morrison's health began deteriorating rapidly, and he was hospitalized several times with complications related to his advanced age. During one of these hospitalizations, his doctors told him privately that he probably had less than 6 months to live and needed to get his affairs in order. Thomas Morrison responded to this news by accelerating his succession planning and working with his attorneys to finalize legal arrangements that would protect his wishes after his death. He knew that his family would challenge anything he tried to do to transfer control of the company away from bloodline heirs, but he was determined to ensure that Morrison Manufacturing would be led by someone who truly understood and valued manufacturing excellence, rather than someone who just wanted to extract wealth. Thomas Morrison called me to his hospital room and explained that he was updating his will and trust documents to reflect his final wishes for the company. He told me that he was creating a complex legal structure that would give me operational control of Morrison Manufacturing after his death, while also protecting the financial interests of his family members, who would receive generous settlements but would not have voting control or management authority. Thomas Morrison acknowledged that this arrangement would certainly be challenged in court by family members who believed they deserved to inherit control of the company, but he had consulted with the best estate planning attorneys in the state, and they were confident the arrangements would survive legal challenges if properly structured and documented. The final months. Thomas Morrison was released from the hospital, but everyone knew his time was limited. He spent his remaining energy working with me every single day to transfer as much knowledge and wisdom as possible before he died. We would spend hours discussing specific situations he had encountered during his career and how he had handled challenges involving difficult employees, demanding customers, economic downturns, technological changes, and countless other issues that business leaders must navigate. Thomas Morrison also introduced me to his network of business contacts, suppliers, customers, and industry colleagues, so they would know who I was and understand that I had his complete confidence and support. Some of these introductions were awkward because people couldn't understand why a legendary industrialist was introducing a 26-year-old former factory worker as his chosen successor. But Thomas Morrison didn't care what people thought, and he made sure everyone understood that I spoke with his authority. The most important thing Thomas Morrison did during these final months was have lengthy conversations with me about his philosophy of business and life, which emphasized treating employees with respect, maintaining quality and integrity, even when cutting corners would be more profitable, thinking about long-term consequences rather than short-term gains, and remembering that business success is meaningless if it comes at the cost of your humanity. The final goodbye. Thomas Morrison died peacefully in his sleep on June 15, 2024, surrounded by family members who had rushed to his bedside when doctors said the end was near. I was not invited to be there during his final moments because the family made it clear that I was not welcome. But Thomas Morrison had anticipated this and had left me a personal video message recorded weeks earlier when he knew his death was approaching. In the video, Thomas Morrison thanked me for giving him hope during his final years that Morrison Manufacturing would continue to thrive after he was gone. And he told me that I had reminded him why he had fallen in love with manufacturing so many decades ago. He said that leading the company would be the hardest thing I had ever done, and that I would face opposition, criticism, and moments when I questioned whether I was capable of handling such enormous responsibility. But he had absolute confidence that I would succeed because I possessed the rare combination of technical excellence, strategic thinking, and genuine care for people that defines truly great leaders. Thomas Morrison's final words in the video were that I should never forget where I came from or lose the perspective that comes from having worked on the factory floor, because that understanding of how manufacturing really works would be my greatest advantage over competitors who only knew business from boardrooms and spreadsheets.
The will reading. The reading of Thomas Morrison's will 3 weeks after his death was one of the most dramatic and contentious events I have ever experienced. The Morrison family gathered in a large conference room at the estate attorney's office, expecting to hear about how Thomas Morrison's $500 million fortune would be divided among his children and grandchildren. What they heard instead was that Thomas Morrison had structured his estate to give me operational control of Morrison Manufacturing through a complex trust arrangement, while family members would receive financial distributions but no management authority or voting control. The room exploded with angry shouting as family members accused me of manipulating a dying man and threatened to challenge the will in every possible legal forum. David Morrison was particularly venomous, and he stood up and pointed at me and said that a factory girl with no business education had no right to control a company his family had built, and he would spend every dollar necessary to overturn his grandfather's insane decision. The estate attorney calmly explained that Thomas Morrison had anticipated these objections and had taken extraordinary legal precautions to ensure his wishes would be respected, including obtaining multiple medical evaluations, confirming his mental competency, and creating detailed video recordings explaining his reasoning that would be very persuasive to any judge who might hear challenges to the will. The attorney also revealed that Thomas Morrison had included provisions that would dramatically reduce the inheritances of any family members who challenged the succession plan, which created a powerful financial incentive for the family to accept the arrangement, even if they hated it. The legal battle. Despite the financial penalties for challenging the will, David Morrison and several other family members filed lawsuits attempting to overturn Thomas Morrison's succession plan and arguing that I had unduly influenced a vulnerable elderly man. The legal battle consumed 8 months and cost both sides millions of dollars in attorney fees as lawyers argued about testamentary capacity, undue influence, fiduciary duties, and corporate governance principles. I had to sit through grueling depositions where hostile attorneys tried to portray me as a gold digger who had seduced an old man for his money, even though my relationship with Thomas Morrison had been entirely professional and focused on manufacturing and business. The Morrison family's attorneys brought in experts who testified that it was highly unusual and suspicious for a wealthy industrialist to leave control of his company to someone outside the family, and that this deviation from normal practice suggested manipulation.
But my attorneys countered with testimony from dozens of people who had witnessed my relationship with Thomas Morrison and who had confirmed that he had been completely lucid and determined in his decision to prepare me for leadership based on my demonstrated abilities. The judge who heard the case ultimately ruled that Thomas Morrison had every legal right to structure his estate however he wished, and that the evidence clearly showed he had made his decisions with full mental capacity and without any improper influence. The ruling upheld the succession plan exactly as Thomas Morrison had designed it, which meant that at age 26, I suddenly found myself in operational control of a $500 million manufacturing company. The transformation begins. Taking actual control of Morrison Manufacturing was simultaneously exhilarating and terrifying because I was now responsible for 3,000 employees and their families, plus millions of dollars in daily operations. The first few months were incredibly difficult, as I struggled to establish credibility with executives who resented taking orders from someone they still thought of as a factory worker. Many senior managers quit rather than work under my leadership, and some suppliers and customers questioned whether they wanted to continue business relationships with a company led by someone so young and inexperienced. David Morrison, who had lost his expected inheritance, became actively hostile and started his own competing manufacturing company funded by his settlement from the estate, and he openly vowed to destroy Morrison Manufacturing and prove that his grandfather had made a terrible mistake. But I had advantages that my critics didn't fully appreciate, including deep knowledge of our manufacturing processes from having actually worked on the factory floor, fresh perspectives that weren't limited by industry conventional wisdom, and genuine relationships with factory workers who respected me because I had been one of them. I spent my first year implementing aggressive improvements to manufacturing efficiency, quality control, worker safety, and customer service that had been delayed or ignored by previous management who were comfortable with the status quo. The results were remarkable as we reduced production costs by 19%, improved delivery times by 27%, decreased defect rates by 43%, and increased worker satisfaction scores to the highest levels in company history. Our financial performance improved so dramatically that several major customers who had been considering switching to competitors instead increased their orders, and our reputation in the industry began to shift from a traditional old-line manufacturer to an innovative leader in production excellence. The vindication. 3 years after taking control of Morrison Manufacturing, I have transformed the company in ways that have exceeded even Thomas Morrison's optimistic expectations. Annual revenue has grown from $500 million to over $800 million through a combination of operational improvements, new customer acquisitions, and strategic expansion into adjacent markets. We have become known throughout the automotive industry as the manufacturer that consistently delivers the highest quality components with the most reliable delivery schedules, which has allowed us to command premium pricing that our competitors cannot match. Most satisfying has been watching David Morrison's competing manufacturing companies struggle and eventually fail because he tried to compete on price rather than quality and couldn't maintain the operational excellence that his grandfather had spent 75 years building. I have also used my position to implement programs that provide educational opportunities and career advancement paths for factory workers who demonstrate exceptional potential, just as Thomas Morrison did for me. We now have over 50 former production workers who have earned engineering degrees or business certifications through company-sponsored education programs, and many of them have moved into technical or management positions where they contribute perspectives that people who never worked on factory floors could never provide. The story of how a factory girl inherited a manufacturing empire has been featured in business magazines and news programs as an example of how unconventional succession planning can work when based on genuine merit rather than family relationships or traditional credentials. I often think about Thomas Morrison and how grateful I am that he saw potential in me when everyone else just saw a factory worker. and I try to honor his memory by leading Morrison Manufacturing with the same commitment to excellence, integrity, and respect for people that defined his 75-year career. Sometimes the person everyone underestimates becomes the one who transforms everything.